It's really a delight. Both of us are delighted to be here.
I'm delighted. We have two delighted Dans.
Dan, I really enjoyed this book.
Well, thank you.
And I have to
If
say,
you didn't, this would not be a good time to tell me that. But anyway, but I'm relieved, Dan.
Yeah, there's something I have to tell you. No, I really enjoyed it, and actually it came at a good time.
Okay.
When it came was
yes,
it came at right when I wanted to read it. One of the things that I've long admired about your writing is that you do what so many of us try to do and so many of us fail at, which is you take a really difficult scientific literature and you distill it down to what the important message is when there is one, and you make it really easy to read. I mean, it's the book is easy to read. The wonderful references section, but I'm imagining, because I try to do this too, I'm imagining you probably read more articles than made it to the bibliography. How many did you read?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I think that I basically live most of my life exists on Dropbox these days. And so at one point there was so much research out there on this subject that for the first time I brought in basically 1 1/4 research assistants to help me sort through all this stuff. And when we finally did a count of all the papers that one of us had read, it was over 700. Because, yeah.
Well, you have to, right? You have to read 700 papers to find a couple of hundred that are relevant and that...
Yeah, or to find that 50 that are relevant.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And then also in this particular case, since I was going at this subject of timing, I think one of the things that I saw as a non-academic, and it always surprises me, is that you had in this question of timing, like when are we going to, how do we make our decisions about when to do things? Do we make them based on intuition and guesswork, or do we use some evidence? Do we use some data? Do we use some facts to make these decisions? What I found is that there is research out there, but it's across many, many disciplines. And one of the interesting things about academics that I find is that they don't talk to each other across disciplines. They barely talk to each other within disciplines. So
they talk a lot to themselves.
They love talking to themselves. But even in the field of psychology, you have the cognitive, the developmental psychologists don't always talk to the personality psychologists, and don't always talk to the social psychologists. Right. And they're barely talking to the economists. And this research was like an endocrinology and anesthesiology,
right.
And like nobody's talking to the endocrinologists,
right.
Understandably, perhaps.
Right.
And yet they were all asking very, very similar questions. And I think sometimes it takes a non-specialist, a non-expert, to have that kind of beginner's mind or that kind of perspective to look back and say, hey, guys, you're all asking very similar questions.
What a nice job. For those of you that haven't read the book yet or haven't seen it, it's a book about the idea is that we've, as a society and as functioning decision-making people, we pay a lot more attention to the what in decision-making than to the when, and we tend to undervalue timing as a life force, as something that influences the shape of your decision-making and the shape of your life and happiness and success. You mentioned a few things in the book that changed your mind, that you learned. I wonder if you'd share one or two with us, things that surprised you about the when of things.
Oh, so I mean, there's so much that surprised me in all of this, and I think this is it's partly a tribute to the fact that I didn't know very much going in. And for this book, like for a couple of other books, I had done some research and I had some level of theory of the case when I went into writing it. This one I truly did not. I really went in animated by my own frustration, saying, okay, why don't we know more about this? Why isn't there some guidance about this? And I think the research is there. Like, this is a book I want to read. I really want to read this book, and oh God, what a pain in the ass. I got to write it in order to read it. And so I was really surprised. So one thing that I was really surprised by, I was surprised by the size of the effect of time of day on performance.
Yeah.
I mean, I understood that there would be some.
You mean like the Judges study, for example?
So many of these studies. This idea that was sort of a revelation to me. I wish I had known it, before I was in my 50s. Something as fundamental as this: our cognitive abilities don't stay the same throughout the day. They change. They change in material ways. They can sometimes change in very significant ways. And
mine change in immaterial ways.
but simply knowing that is, forces you to make different decisions about what you do when. Other things about I have a chapter on how do groups synchronize in time, and I was really blown away by the research on something like choral singing, and what choral singing does to our bodies and our minds when what we do when we are in sync with other people. So choral singing, for instance, when people sing in choruses, if you were a chorus singing, there's evidence that your hearts would start beating basically in sync. It's not surprising. Choral singing gives people a mood boost. That's not that surprising. I think it becomes more surprising when you say it's a prophylactic against depression. It becomes more surprising when you say choral singing actually has a physiological effect. So if you were to, let's say you're choral singers, I draw your blood, measure your immunoglobulin levels, you sing in a chorus, not singing alone. Singing alone doesn't do this. You sing in a chorus, then I draw blood again afterwards, your immunoglobulin levels likely have risen. Your immune response is higher. And that just blew me away.
It converges nicely with some work that we did in my lab some years ago that shows that when people perform music together, especially singing, but also playing music together, or even listening together, their brain waves synchronize with one another.
Yeah. There was some stuff that came out recently on that, on like couples holding hands.
Oh, I didn't see
Yeah, something about how romantic couples holding hands have a kind of brainwave synchrony from the touch. That it doesn't necessarily activate it. Like if you and I were a couple, and it wouldn't necessarily activate when we were like this, but if we were holding hands, there would be some kind. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. What do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that synchronization is so powerful? I mean, I don't know. I wanted to answer that question. I didn't think there was good enough evidence to answer that question. So, what's your guess on that?
Why do I think the synchronization happens, or why do we experience it as powerful?
Either or both.
Well, I think it happens because there was this evolutionary pressure for all of us as we left the safety of trees when we were originally tree dwellers. We left, the theory goes, we left being tree dwellers for the savanna because we needed to increase the potential sources of food. And in doing so, we made ourselves prone to being predated upon predators. And so we had to form bands. Even though we might have been individualistic, we had to form bonds with others to protect ourselves. Certainly, you needed to work with others to take down a mastodon or something.
Sure.
And so the good feeling that you get from coordinating your actions with others had some evolutionary advantage, and so.
And the people who didn't get that good feeling from coordinating were eaten by the
right.
predators. No, seriously, yeah. No, I think that. So I think that's a great argument. Evolutionary arguments are very difficult to prove, obviously.
Right. Well, when we get the Wayback Machine, we'll know.
Yeah, but I think the same thing is true because I also write about this pattern of the day where we experience the day in basically, and you see it in some of the studies of mood. In general, it's a little more complicated than I'm going to make it out, but sort of a peak, a trough, and a rebound. And so why is there that trough in attention and in mood, in the early afternoon? And I think there's an evolutionary argument for that, and that we're out of the trees, the sun is beating down on us, the people who got sleepy around that time of day probably went under the tree to have a nap, didn't get eaten by the predators. The people who are out in the burning sun either got eaten or died of sunstroke and didn't pass their genes along. And so that trough that we experience in the early afternoon is probably was an evolutionary advantage.
Right. I think it's biological. I don't think it's just societal.
No, I don't.
Right. I think it's in our biology.
Absolutely.
And it's related to the fact that until eventually the electric light bulb, really, we tended to sleep in two bouts. We'd go to sleep when it got dark after the meal. We'd sleep for 3 or 4 hours and then get up and be awake for 2 or 3 hours and then go back to sleep. And throughout history, this was the norm. And so it makes sense that there would be a drowsiness that hits after lunchtime. Just on the biology.
Absolutely.
So, when I was, maybe you could tell us about the judges study, because that's one of my favorite.
Well, it's alarming. I mean, it's a fascinating study. So one of the things that I wrote about in this book is I start out by talking about the unit of a day, and the reason for that is that when you start, as someone who spent devoted no brain power to thinking about time or writing about time, I was surprised by how many units of time they're not natural in any way. So a second is not a natural thing. All right, it's something that human beings have invented. A week is not a thing. It's something that human beings have invented. But a day is a thing, right? This is the level of scientific sophistication I'm bringing to this book, all right? A day into this conversation here with Dan. A day is a thing, right? It's because we're on a planet, and that planet is turning. So look at the day, and the diurnal patterns of the day are significant, all right? It's not everything. It's not more important than what we do, but in many cases, they're as important as what we do. And you see this in this study of judges in Israel. So and this is, I think, probably, most of the stuff I write about is fairly obscure. This piece of research has gotten some attention out there. And so it's a study of judges in Israel. And these judges are making decisions about parole. So prisoners come to them saying, I've served 5 years, I should be able to go free. I've been wearing an ankle monitor for 2 years, I should be able to remove that ankle monitor. And so these judges are making pretty significant decisions, certainly in a moral sense. And this is the thing that really makes me alarmed about this. In a moral sense, these judges are making incredibly weighty decisions, because in this case, the state has taken away somebody's liberty. That's a big deal. And the state now is saying, we're going to give you your liberty back. So the moral weight of this is significant. And so what these researchers did is they looked at time of day and the judges and the decisions that the judges made. And what they found is that, I'll draw the chart for you in the air, because I think it's actually, the chart is actually really, really powerful.
Those of you who are tripping on LSD will see the trace after the finger mix.
So here's the chart. It's the invisible. This is like a Marcel Marceau chart here. Here we go. This axis, the vertical axis, is your odds of getting parole. Okay, your likelihood of getting parole, and this is time of day. And what you saw is basically a pattern like this. Okay, but it gets even more interesting. Then you give a judge a break. Okay, give the judge a break here. Your odds go back up after the break, and then back down. And then you give the judge another break. Your odds go back up. Now it's totally interesting, but it's somewhat terrifying in a way. Because if you look at, if your parole hearing is early in the day, your odds of getting parole in this particular case were pretty high. But as the day went on, they dropped dramatically. It's like a ski slope here. And then the other interesting thing is, like, immediately after the judge's break, your odds get even higher. So if you think about this, you have to think about the randomness here, because parole hearings are essentially random, the scheduling of them. It's a bureaucratic thing, and it's also like going to the DMV. How long is it going to take to be at the DMV? It depends on how long the people in front of you are, right? And so if you have a loved one who comes in for parole right before the judge has her break, your odds of getting parole are pretty much in the single digits. All right, single-digit percentages. But if the guy behind, the guy who says get the ticket next, comes in after the judge's break, his odds go back to something like 70%. Yeah, it's a wow. And so, so this teaches a lot of things. It basically says that all times of day are not created equal, that we behave differently at different times of day. But I think this study is actually really interesting in what it reveals about breaks, because in this particular case, seeing a judge before a break and seeing a judge after a break is tantamount to being before a different judge. These research about breaks is just, I originally had breaks as a component of the first chapter about the day, but I was so amazed by the research. Basically, the material was saying, We need our own chapter. 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 I said, take a break, guys. We need our own chapter. Yeah. We need our own chapter. And the break stuff is really interesting. We should be. I became a convert because I've been a sinner on this one. I was someone who believed in this idea of powering through. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. It's interesting. I think it's peculiar, not totally American, but I mean East Asians I think have this powering through thing as well. But it's peculiarly American. It's so weird about America is that no matter where you came from, no matter where your family came from in America, it's almost as if you stand on the soil in America and you begin to absorb through your feet this sort of puritanical view of certain aspects of our life. So it's like not only more productive to power through, but it's morally virtuous, to power through.
There are some industries that don't allow this. For example, the air traffic controllers.
Absolutely right.
In no country that has airports.
Yeah.
So it's not every country, but
right.
Every country in the world with an airport has some kind of air traffic control system, and air traffic controllers are mandated not to work more than an hour and a half or 2 hours at a stretch. They're required by law to take a break, and the break has to be a real break, not checking Facebook. They have to really right. And what other profession has the mandated breaks? I mean, when you think about what the most stressful job in the world might be, air traffic controllers.
I would put that up there, yeah.
Another stressful job is simultaneous translator at the UN.
I believe that totally.
Because you get one word wrong.
Absolutely.
The bombs are flying. The aircraft carriers are going out.
Yeah.
So they're not allowed to work more than a couple hours.
Yeah. And yet, so that somehow we think that we're somehow we're somehow superior, or that we don't need to do that, and we do. And what Dan is saying is, like, when you look at the research, I'm convinced that the science of breaks right now is where the science of sleep was 15 years ago. That 15 years ago, you would have in certain workplace cultures, somebody would come in and say, I pulled an all-nighter last night. I haven't gotten more than 4 hours of sleep any night for the last week. And I remember working with people like that, and they always made me feel bad. I'm not joking. They really did. It's like, oh crap, I can't do that. Like, I had a boss who would do all-nighters. I freaking hated it. I was miserable that whole time. But what happened in the last 15 years or so? The science of sleep has deepened somewhat, but it certainly reached public consciousness. And so now someone comes in and says, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. We don't say you're a hero. We say you're an idiot. You're hurting your performance. You're hurting other people's performances probably. I think that breaks are where sleep was 15 years ago, that we should be taking more breaks. And I think the research gives us some clues, and Dan alluded to one element of this, of the kinds of breaks that we should be taking. They should be real breaks. And what we know about breaks, and there's a nice, I think, this is one area where the research yields, I think, very, very practical design principles for breaks, is that we know that something is better than nothing. So even a tiny break is better than no break at all. We know that social is better than solo, which I found kind of surprising, in that having a break with somebody else, assuming you choose the person, having a break with somebody else is more restorative than having a break on your own. That's true even for introverts, which is surprising to me. I'd like them to recheck that one. We know that outside beats inside. So I was, again, new to this stuff. The research on nature but there's an evolutionary explanation for that, I think, too. We know that moving beats stationary. I think people have sort of absorbed the meme that sitting is the new smoking, right? That we should be moving around. And then also, to Dan's point earlier, we know that fully detached beats semi-detached, that you really need that full detachment. And so at some level, there's this platonic ideal of a break, which is take a 10 or 15-minute break outside, walking around with somebody you like, leaving your phone behind, talking about something other than work. I mean, it's really not that simple. It's not really not that complicated. And the tactical thing that I've started doing in terms of changing my own life is being intentional about it and actually literally making a break list. Dan and I were talking beforehand. I work in the garage behind my house. And so I will write down, my list of things to do for the day, like 1 p.m., walk. And I will go and I'll take a walk around the neighborhood for, 10 minutes. Or like at 4 o'clock, my wife also works at home. And so I'll say to my wife, I'll say, hey, Jessica, you want to walk?
Is it a 2-car garage?
No, she works inside. I get the garage. My workspace is called the garage. Her workspace, which is smaller and in the house, is known as the command center. Yeah, so she totally got the better name. And so you know,
as befits management.
So I'll go to her, you know, maybe like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a post. We live in Washington D.C. There's a post office like a 7-minute walk away. I say, hey Jessica, you want to go walk to the post office, drop something off? And so it's an exciting life, I recognize, yeah. And so we'll people over here are like, that's kind of sad. No, but I'll defend that. So you know, and so we'll go walk.
On date night, do you go to the DMV?
Yeah. We'll also have the you know, tire pressure checked and so forth. No, we'll go take a walk to the post office. 7 minutes. I'll defend this thing. Actually, 7 minutes away, Friendship Heights post called Friendship Station post office. I know there is no post office in America that should have the word friendship in it. So we'll walk there. 7 minutes up, 7 minutes back. We never take our phones. We hardly ever talk about work. We talk about like what we're going to have for dinner, you know, and so those kinds of things. Knowing the science and then putting the science into action by being intentional about it is really the key.
You were talking about time of day a moment ago. So we talked about breaks, but what led us into that was time of day.
Yeah.
And you write about how people perform logic problems better in the morning.
Yeah.
But insight problems later in the afternoon are better performed. And so presumably creative acts are better in the afternoon because they require the filters being off and less inhibition.
Yeah.
It got me to thinking maybe this is why musicians, particularly improvising ones, want to play at night.
You know what? Well, I'll see you and raise you on that point. No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting. I think it's a really interesting point. So the first thing is that we have to factor in this something called a chronotype, which is basically your propensity to. There's a whole field called chronobiology, the study of our biological rhythms, and so we have these propensities. Or are we early risers? Do we wake up early and go to sleep early? Do we wake up late and go to sleep late? And the distribution basically looks like 15% of people are larks, super early people, strong early people. 20% are owls, and about 2/3 of us are in the middle. And the distribution, so it's not a bell curve because you got 15-20. But the other thing is that owls, there's some really owly people out there. So I don't know why I keep drawing charts in the air, but for the two of you on LSD, this is the best night you've had in a while.
So two.
Oh, that's right. We're in Santa Monica. The distribution is there's a very long tail for owls over here. So there's some crazy owly people, and so in general, but 80% of us, the people in the middle, we go through the day in this peak trough recovery. So we're better at these focused analytic problems early because we're more vigilant, and then later in the day, our mood is higher, but we're less vigilant. We have the filters off. I think that's a good argument, perhaps, for musicians. The other thing is, my guess is that the chronotypes of musicians would be owlier, much owlier than say a school teacher in general. That owls might have a proclivity.
But still, there's no musician or stand-up comedian who's waking up at 8 p.m. and then going on stage at 9, right? I mean, they're not larks, but shifted. I mean, they're not not owls who can be immune to this.
No, right. Yeah.
It's still after you've been awake about 6 or 8 hours, you're going to be more creative, regardless of when you get up.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I think that the ability to sustain, like just basically being able to stay awake and do your work, probably benefits from that.
Sure.
Even that, the evening chronotype. There's also, if you look at some of the differences in personality. So if you look at even measures of divergent thinking and creativity, owls are higher. They actually measure on sort of straight intelligence. Owls test higher. They also test more prone to depression, addiction, self-harm. So I'm basically describing musicians right there.
Right.
Yeah.
And comedians.
Yeah.
So the theme of the book is that when we try to understand why things go the way we want them to, or why they didn't, why things failed, we tend to look at what led to the undesirable outcome rather than when. That's the theme of the book. Of course, this when problem that you've identified is actually a what problem. I ask you what went wrong, and you say we didn't pay attention to when.
Uh-huh. So who's on first?
There's a kind of irony in there.
Yeah. No, I think that's. I think it's a fair point. I think it goes in. At a sort of a top level, at some level, like a lot of work, the work that you've done in your lab and in your writing, and a lot of the work in many fields of behavioral science, it's ultimately about decision making and how flawed human decision making is. Yeah. Like we just suck at making decisions generally, and even worse than that, there's a meta problem that we don't know how bad we are.
Right.
And what we need is some ways to improve our decision making. One way to do that would be simple rules that we can follow, so we don't have to. We're not always decide. Dan wrote a book called The Organized Mind, which is basically an argument for that, is that we're prone, basically, this is not his words, but we're prone to sort of an entropy we're prone to disorder. And so you can try to wrestle your own mind into order. That's really hard. Or you can change your environment externally to deal with that. And that's
exactly.
And it's similar. It's
right.
similar. It's similar here.
Right.
So what we can do is we can say, okay, here's what we know about diurnal patterns and what we should do. In general, we should do our analytic work during the peak. All right. So for most of us, that's the morning. For owls, it's later in the day. We should be doing our analytic work during the peak, work that requires heads down focus, vigilance, and attention. During this trough, which is really bad, folks. It's not just, I get a little bit sleepy. It's really bad. The data on, first of all, one thing, if you learn nothing else about this, I'm going to go on a little off-ramp here. Don't go to the hospital in the afternoon if you can avoid it. I mean that very seriously. Don't laugh, man. You go to the hospital in the afternoon. I'll be laughing, all right? Because you know what? There's the odds of an anesthesia error. 4 times more. I think that's one of the LSD people.
Yeah.
4 times more likely at 3 p.m. than at 9 a.m. An anesthesia error. If you look at, we're among friends here. Let's talk about colonoscopies, right? Ask afternoon colonoscopies versus morning colonoscopies. Doctors find half as many polyps in afternoon exams as they do in morning exams. If you look at hand washing in hospitals in the afternoon, huge deterioration in hand washing in hospitals in the afternoon. If you look at prescribing of unnecessary antibiotics, significant rise in prescriptions of unnecessary antibiotics in afternoon appointments versus morning.
Absolutely right. Everything you look at that could go wrong in a hospital tends to happen later in the day.
Absolutely.
When people aren't as vigilant.
Absolutely right. And so again, it goes to decision making. So he's like, okay, maybe I should arrange my schedule so that I'm not. Truly, I'm not joking. I don't let anybody in my family go to a hospital or an important doctor's appointment when there's discretion there. In the afternoon, we will rearrange family schedules and whatever to make sure that we're having appointments in the morning. So during that trough, we should be doing. Here's the thing. So we know that our analytic work we should be doing during the peak, which again for most of us is the morning. For owls, it's later in the day. We know that this trough midday. We should be doing our administrative work there. We should be doing our routine email. We should be filling out our TPS reports. We should be doing the stuff that doesn't require massive cognitive load. And then the recovery period, again, we have this pattern in general of mood. What Dan said before about inhibitions is exactly right. Disinhibition is the opposite of vigilance, right? So we're vigilant in this period. We're disinhibited here. And so, but we also have rising mood. So disinhibition plus rising mood makes it a good time for brainstorming. And so those design principles, again, we can change the we don't have to, it's hard to change as Dan has written about, it's hard to change we can't change our brains, and we can't wrestle them to the ground. What we can do is change our environment so that we navigate it more effectively. So put your administrative work, analytic work in the peak, administrative work in the trough, insight work in the recovery. Now here's the problem. We don't do that. The design principles are very clear. We don't do that. I don't do that sometimes. I changed the way I work based on this book, but I'm a writer, so I'm much more of a morning person than an evening person. So I should be doing my writing in the morning, and I sort of had an intuitive sense of that. But what I would do is I would come into my office many, many days, garage behind my house, not the command center, unfortunately. Sometimes I'm allowed to sit in the command center.
On the floor.
Yeah. No, it's sort of like if you go into the Oval Office and like spin around in the president's chair. That's sort of what I do. And so I'll come.
This president may spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
No, I'm with you. Listen. I'm at the point now. I had a conversation with someone at the earlier today, about an hour ago, where I literally, I'm not joking. I literally looked at my phone. I looked at my phone. It's a guy named Mark who I was talking to. Where's Mark? Mark can be my fact checker. There's Mark. There he is. Okay. So you can verify this. All right. So I looked at my phone. It's like, oh, good. It's 10:20 in the East Coast. We're probably not going to have a constitutional crisis today. Now I forgot what I was. Now I'm thinking about constitutional crisis. So we're.
You don't follow your own advice.
Yeah. So I go into the distraction here. I'm distracted. I was trying to multitask by telling two different narrative strains, and I can't do that. So,
not at this hour. Tomorrow morning at the talk.
Never. So, I had an intuitive sense. I go into my office and I got to do some writing today. In my office at a reasonable hour, 8:15, 8:30. Let's go. Let's get some good writing done today, Dan. First, I got to check some email. Make sure. Check my email. Okay, got that. Cleared the deck. Feel better. Fresh slate here.
Have you checked Facebook yet?
Well, I don't really use. I check Facebook sometimes, but there's got to be something going on Twitter. So let me go check Twitter. All right, then it's like, oh, maybe I think I need a muffin right now. Just get some fuel in my system, get ready to go. And then 3 ESPN highlight reels later, my best period is squandered. Yeah. And then I try to do my writing, which is hard. Writing is always hard, even if you write for a living, as both of us do. It's always really hard. It's very, very difficult and challenging to confront that blinking cursor, to make the words march in the right order. It's really hard work. And so I start doing it in the trough, which is basically the worst time of day to do anything. And it's like riding a bicycle uphill against the wind. So even though we have these principles, we don't do it enough. So we have to redesign the environment in some ways to make sure you do that. And so what I do is, for instance, I no longer, on writing days, I don't bring my phone into the office. I don't turn on my email. Right? Those two things alone can help me get that done.
That's huge.
Now the worst thing, though, in terms of figuring out, so we're trying to match what we should do at certain times of day. I end up doing a lot of my interviews later in the day. And I've scheduled a lot of my interviews when I'm the interviewer for research and things like that, because I'm not an investigative reporter, so I'm not trying to track people. I'm not taking a deposition. I'm not trying to trap people or anything like that. My interviews are, in some ways like this conversation, saying, hey, what do you think about that? Oh, that's cool, so a little bit looser. And if you think about the individuals, what's even worse are organizations, all right? So again, we know this. Peak, analytic work, trough, administrative work, recovery, insight work. Now think about organizations. Most of you probably work for organizations. Anybody who worked for an organization do you ever go to meetings? Okay, think about when we schedule meetings, we use only one criterion in scheduling meetings. What is it? Totally. Who said that? Oh, somebody. Yeah, availability. Totally. Availability. Availability of people, availability of spaces. That's it. We don't say, do we need people to be disinhibited and more freewheeling? Do we need people to be locked down and analytical? Who's going to be there? Morning people? Evening people? We just say, who's available? What room is available? And it's like whatever. I don't know what the opposite of strategic is. What's the word is the opposite of strategic? I have no idea what that is. What non-strategic? Thank you. Yeah. I was going to say
this is a writer, folks.
I was going to say there's a lexical gap there, but apparently there's not. Non-strategic. Yeah, it's the most non-strategic thing that you can do, because we think that when we schedule meetings is not a strategic issue. It is.
Yeah. Well,
schedule your meetings more properly.
This is very real,
Yeah.
a very real thing, and it's absolutely crucial that we recognize what our own strengths and weaknesses are, and then put systems in place in our schedules and in our physical environment to help us to perform our best.
Yeah, and this is essentially the temporal piece of that.
Right.
It's basically when should you do certain kinds of work? And what we should do is we should actually refashion our schedule so we're doing the right work at the right time. What some of this research shows is that time of day, just time of day alone, explains about 20% of the variance in how people perform on these cognitive tasks. So thank you for that. That's a total wow, right? So if we think about variance, like how do we explain variance how do we explain the variance in how people perform cognitively, how people perform at work? There are all kinds of explanations for that, right? Some people are smarter than others. Some people are more conscientious than others. Some people have more social advantage than others, right? But we're saying 20% of that variance is explained by time of day? Holy smokes. And that's something we can do something about.
Yeah. Well, there's so much color in the book. There's so many colorful stories. Tell us about the Dabbawallas.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I really enjoyed doing that. So this is a chapter on synchronization. And so has anybody been to or maybe even lived or grown up in Mumbai, India? Any chance? A few of you have been there? Okay, cool. So it's a very interesting feature of Indian life in general and life in Mumbai, which is a crazy, sprawling, massive, crazy city, Mumbai in particular. So the culture in sort of middle class, upper middle class, among middle class, upper middle class Indians who have office jobs is that people don't like going out for lunch to like Wendy's or, fast food places or things like that. They prefer a home-cooked meal. But it's challenging. So if it's so crowded, people have to leave for work very early in the morning. So if you leave for work early at 7 o'clock in the morning, you're not going to get up at 5 to make yourself a home-cooked meal. However, there's also a couple of other things going on culturally in India. One of them is that middle-class and upper-middle-class people sometimes, perhaps often, have cooks who live there. And then you also have intergenerational families. So a lot of times, grandma is around. And so what will happen is that the son or daughter will go off, 30-something, 40-something, 50-something, son or daughter will go off to work in downtown Mumbai. But then around 7 in the morning, the grandmother or the cook will start preparing like a real lunch, like a good lunch, chapatis and dal and cooked vegetables, like a really good, proper lunch that they will put in these things called tiffins, which are these metal containers that then stack up, that stack up like that. Now, you have a problem, though. You've got the lunch here in the outskirts of Mumbai in these tiffins. You've got the son or daughter, 30-something, 40-something, 50-something office worker, 20 miles away in downtown Mumbai. How's it going to get there? Here's where it gets interesting. There's these guys called Dabbawallas. Right? Walla means basically servant, merchant, doer, sort of, and then Dabba is the tiffin. And so what they do is they go around and collect these lunches that are home-cooked and then deliver them to the offices in downtown Mumbai, 20 miles away. Now, that's kind of interesting right there. But here's what's even more interesting. They do this without any technology. They don't have UPC codes. They don't use GPS. It's not like an Uber where you can track your chapatis coming in. Why are you turning there? And the people who are doing it, these fellows who are called Dabbawallas, most of them have about an 8th grade education. So now, do they do this accurately? They deliver these lunches, 200,000 lunches every day, with an accuracy that's so great. FedEx has gone to study them. UPS has gone to study them. There's a Harvard Business School case study about them. So how are they so exquisitely coordinated? And that ends up being a window into how do groups coordinate in time? And some of the principles there of how they coordinate end up being applicable to other kinds of group synchronization, particularly choirs. I'm now obsessed with choirs, but even rowing teams. And so and what you have is certain principles about how groups coordinate, and one of them in this particular case is that the importance of a single clear boss, which for these double walls is a clock. There's a certain train that they have to make. If they don't make this train, it's 1040 something train, everything collapses. They have to make this. They have to make this train. And then what I think was so interesting, and I didn't realize like how big of a field this was, and I found it fascinating, is how essential belonging is to the synchronization. And I think it ends up being true more broadly for any kind of team, that these belonging cues of things, the way you dress, the language that you use, even things like touch. There's an interesting study in the NBA where they had people watch videos of teams early in the season and count. It's a lovely phrase in the paper. It's like, we had them count high fives, low fives, chest bumps, fist bumps, and all the variety of things that NBA players could do to touch each other. And it turns out that the degree of touching was predictive of how well the teams did. And so these kinds of belonging cues help people synchronize. And then when you get into this idea of just of a sense of purpose, there's a deep sense of purpose in these folks.
The Dabawalas feel that their work is important.
Deeply important. They refer to it as a sacred mission.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this sense of belonging, a sense of purpose.
And the purpose is the way they've encoded it, the way they've framed it for themselves, is that they're helping the beloved family member at home to stay in touch with the worker who's so far away. It creates this bonding across the generations, or at least across distance, if it's a husband and wife.
Exactly.
It's a very deeply meaningful thing that they're doing. They're bringing the food, the sustenance, from one family member to another and back.
Absolutely. So I think that's a key point of this. And it makes it different from, say, delivering a Domino's pizza, which is much more of a, at some level, sort of just simply a logistical challenge. It's basically an algorithmic challenge at this point. And so there's something. So when you look at these kinds of things about how groups coordinate, I think it ends up revealing something about human beings. We want to have that sense of connection to others. We want to have that sense of purpose. And those things that seem superficially kind of touchy-feely, like belonging cues and purpose and things, actually end up having a value with efficiency and productivity as well.
The book touches on so many.
And I got a chance to. It was cool because I actually went to Mumbai and I went around with these guys. And so I spent the day with them, meeting for tea early in the morning, and then we were in an auto rickshaw behind the guy on his bicycle, and I literally would go up the steps of the apartment building with the guy, and sometimes there's chit chat when you pick up the lunch, sometimes there's not, sometimes they just stick their hand out like that, and then they have this really bizarre sorting thing where the Dabawalas collect their lunches. And they just take them in front of the train station, they just dump them all on the ground. And remember, there's no UPC code. Instead, there are these almost like cryptic Dan Brown style symbols on the.
I knew you'd work another Dan into this conversation.
That's how I got it from you. I was thinking about that.
I think when they make the movie of this book, Daniel Craig will play.
Yeah. They have these cryptic symbols on there, and they sort them really quickly, and it's something that an outsider can't really see. And then they sling them on their back, and they get on the train, and then they get off at certain stops, and then they throw them on the ground again, and they resort them, and it's just kind of amazing to see that whole cycle. And then I forgot.
Right. So then
they pick them up. Then the Dabawalas have lunch, and then they pick up the empties.
Yeah. So that's the part I don't get.
Yeah.
The reason you deliver the food to the worker is that the worker didn't have time to make it for him or herself.
Yeah.
Somebody would have had to get up at 5 in the morning to do it. So they bring the meal there. But now the worker could take the empty back home with him. But
exactly.
But why do the Dabawalas take the empty back?
You know what? I asked that very question, and they said it's not a great answer. They said, that's what we've always done, and we want to, and we want to, no, that was the main reason. And then when they, so I asked the Dabawallas themselves that, and again, I had a translator with me because the Dabawallas speak, they don't speak Hindu, I don't speak Hindu either, but they don't speak Hindu, they speak Marathi, which is the language of Maharashtra, the state of Maharashtra, and so I asked them that question, and that was their answer, and then we asked the head guy, the guy in charge of this, all of it, and his view initially is like, that's what we've always done, and then he realizes that's not a great answer, and he says, oh, we want to be convenient to the customer. I'm not sure there is a great logic in the.
Well, so there's another aspect of this that really fascinated me, because I hadn't thought about it until you wrote about it. So if you want this to be efficient, which it is, it's tremendously efficient, you want to have the Dabawallas picking up. You wanted them to have a territory where they pick up from a neighborhood, basically, right?
Exactly.
You don't want a Dabawalla to have to pick up here and then you bicycle 5 miles to pick up another.
Right.
All the pickups should be in the same place.
Right.
That makes sense.
Totally.
Of course, when they get to downtown Mumbai, just because the meals were created contiguously doesn't mean they're going to be delivered to contiguous neighborhoods.
No, not at all.
So you need to have a separate set of Dabawallas. They need to divide them up according to location again, which is what happens at the train station.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And that's the part that seems like it would, I mean, using UPS as an example, or the Postal Service, it seems like there'd be missed deliveries once in a while.
You know what? And I was so convinced of that, and it's hard. They talk about they talk about how they have 6 sigma accuracy, which is widely. It says in the book it's widely repeated but never shown, and yet every single person I encountered, every single customer, I tried to find that. I tried to find it, and this one guy who I ended up spending some time with, basically sitting there watching him eat his lunch because he was late, and Dabawala had to pick up the empty, and so I was talking to him, and he'd been doing it for 23 years, and his answer was, I think they might have made a mistake once in 23 years. And then another guy at the door said, oh yeah, if you think about this, you have these homemade lunches that are going like in bags and on grounds and on people's backs and on this crazy, the commuter trains in Mumbai, are dangerous. They really are. There are no doors, for instance. Okay, so their doors are open as an efficiency measure because so many people are coming on and off.
Like that helicopter in New York?
Yeah, their deaths are routine on these kinds of commuter trains. It's actually pretty, it's terrible. And totally lost my train of thought now because I'm a.
Well, you're talking about trains.
Trains, yes. Accuracy. Oh yeah. Sorry, guys. Here's the thing. It's like I'm proving. I'm usually asleep by this hour of the day, so you think about the journey these lunches themselves are taking, and the one complaint that I got from these customers. And I was looking for this because I wanted to find a story of a glitch to explain the glitch and see what went wrong. I think that would be illuminating, but I couldn't find a glitch. And the one guy said, it's like this lunch is taking this journey from like somebody's apartment, on a bike, on a back, in a train, on a ground, on another bike, past a cow. And this one guy said, yeah, you know what? Sometimes your curry and rice get mixed. And I'm like, dude. Get a real problem. I mean, if you see where this is. So there's something, but anyway, I found that whole issue of synchronization just really, again, partly because it was so new to me, just really, really interesting. Interviewing rowers and seeing like pain thresholds for rowing are higher when you do it in a group rather than separately. Seeing the role, I interviewed also this woman who was the coxswain on the George Washington University women's crew team. And it's this woman who is, she's like 4 feet something tall. She has dwarfism, and she's the coxswain. And this is the frickin' boss of this boat here. And the way that she calls the races, and the way that everybody looks to her, and the way that that boss synchronizes things is just really quite I was really quite fascinated, and at times also very moved by it, because I think it reveals something elemental about who we are.
The book does a lot of that. There's a lot of thought-provoking stories that go beyond just efficiency and when, but get you thinking about meaning and the meaning of one's work and the meaning of one's life. It was really a great service that you did by writing the book, and this has been a great conversation, which unfortunately is subject to the issue of when, in that I'm told that our time is up and we should turn things over to questions.
All right.
Speaking of timing,
thanks a lot.
Just a quick reminder around here, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. Only Daniel Levitin gets to ask follow-up questions, and we do not believe in two-part questions.
So you mentioned memes, and what's a meme that you think would be beneficial for the world that is not breaks?
A meme?
A meme. So
that would be beneficial for the world? I would say, I'm not sure it works that well as a meme. I mean, maybe if we put a cat with it or something like that, it could work a little bit better. But oh, okay, the Dawkins. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, so we're going big time here. Okay, so not like memes in that, but sort of the Dawkins idea that certain ideas would. I would say it is this. It is to be intentional, and I think that a lot of what we do is not intentional.
Mindfulness.
Yeah, but more than I think there's a difference between intention and mindfulness. Mindfulness, to me, I mean, might be, 6 of one, half dozen of another. But for me, mindfulness often reads as contemplative, in the moment, and present. And I think I'm saying something different, which is intentionality. Okay. So the thing is, if you think about this, so any of you at work today have a to-do list? Did anybody have a to-do list today? That's intentionality right there. All right. You're intentional about what you're going to do. All right. And when it comes to these issues of when, we're not intentional about it. We let it slide. William James, arguably the father of psychology, has this wonderful line that's haunted me ever since I read it. I think it's in Varieties of Religious Experience, which is that something like most of us go through life. This is his phrase: only half awake. Only half awake. And I think that so my meme would be intentional. Be intentional about when you do things. And I think it laps into other elements of our lives. The degree of half awakeness and passivity is alarming to me. Be intentional.
I think that the answer to why the empties are coming back lies in how you set it up as far as the connections of the family and generations. When they come back, the mission was accomplished, the son or daughter ate, and the day is going well.
There could be. That's a good argument. I mean, I think what the head guy would also say, we're serving our customers better by, if you bring it back earlier, it means it can get cleaned earlier and used again for the next day. That might be the kind of thing that is kind of a confected answer when you don't really have a good one. But I think that's a fair point, Alejandro.
So I have a question about food.
Yeah.
Because I've worked very hard to make sure that I eat food midday that keeps my energy up rather than gives me a slump.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much food plays a part in that slump, where some foods just fatigue people and others really rebuild energy, and that's the purpose of good food.
Yeah.
Is to sustain, and I've really been able to sustain it, and I've avoided that slump. So I'm curious what you discovered in relationship to food and when.
You know what? I looked into that, and I was really uncomfortable with what the research said. I didn't feel like there was clear enough guidance. I felt there was a lot of contradictions when it came to eating and when.
So when I encounter these kinds of contradictions in the scientific literature, which is quite often, from my perspective, what it usually means is that you've got what we would call in in neuroscience, individual differences. So it's not that there is no connection between the food you eat and the way it's going to make you feel. It's that there are a whole bunch of different kinds of people that in these experiments got all lumped together, and they really should have been sorted out and done separate experiments on, right? So there's some people who do well with carbs, some people who do well with a high-fat diet, some people do well with a low-fat diet, and we're just not sophisticated enough in designing these studies to separate them out, to reduce the sources of variance.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Like, I think there is a connection between, I think there is a when of eating, all right? It would shock me if there was not. I just don't think we know what it is, or at least I couldn't find it in looking at the.
And it's going to be different from person to person.
Yeah, and that could be why we can't find it. We can't come up with a universal answer.
There's probably some genetic component that at some point 10 years from now will say, oh, well, you're this kind of a person. This is when you should eat, and this is what you should eat at that point.
So at some level, I mean, it becomes sort of like the sort of move toward personalized medicine. It becomes a personalized diet. We say, hey, oh, you have this kind of profile. So I just didn't feel comfortable on it. The one area that I'm really intrigued by, though.
By the way, I should say that one of the things that is special about you as a popularizer of science is that throughout all your books, I've admired that you don't want to go beyond the data. And most people who write popular science, whether they're professional writers or professional scientists, in order to make a bigger headline, we'll come up with some cockamamie story. And you very skillfully and exercise a lot of impulse control in never doing that.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. The other thing that I do is that I've been having this argument for 20 years with my publisher, is I actually put superscript footnotes in the text itself, so that you can, if I make a claim, you can go back and check it. And what a lot of times happens in certain books is that they don't do that, and so you go in the back to the notes, and it's actually hard to figure out which study is supporting which claim. And so, and I've had people, I've had readers come back. Like, there's one thing, I wrote a book called Drive. There was one thing, I don't even know how it happened, but I had absolutely the wrong study in a footnote. And somebody said, you say X, but this paper is about rutabagas, or whatever, And I'm like, what? And I go to look at it, and I'm like, crap. And we, and we fix it. The one area though that I'm, because I think you can be, I know you can be scrupulous and interesting. I mean, like there's so, like I don't think, it's like you can be scrupulous and interesting because there's so much interesting stuff out there. People out there in the world of academics are doing such extraordinary work. You just have to put in the time to like knock out the bad stuff. And I've been burned on that before. I wrote something in a book called To Sell Is Human, about 2 pages about a study that I was really impressed by, and it ended up the researcher made her data available, and somebody, a non-academic somewhere in England, reran the numbers and said, your math is wrong. And she had those kinds of things bother the heck out of me. Anyway, on eating, one more thing on eating. The one area that I think is super interesting and might have some interesting implications down the road, something called time-restricted feeding. You've ever heard of that? There's some research on rats, maybe some other animals too, that show that rats can maintain a steady weight, not quite regardless of what they eat, but sort of let them eat whatever they want as long as they eat within a window of time. It's almost like 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So if you don't eat in that 12-hour window, it doesn't matter so much what you eat during that other 12-hour window, as long as you don't eat during that. And so to me, it's sort of like a first cousin of this intermittent fasting thing that is going on there. But again, it's only in rats, so your mileage may vary.
First, a quick comment, which is that what you said about touching in sports teams, Doc Rivers just 2 or 3 days ago, in praising his team, said this team touches. You watch them, they touch.
Really? So, how are the Clippers doing this year?
They didn't make the playoffs.
Okay, good. Okay, you made the playoffs. All right. So you're not stuck in that 1-game playoff that's happening tonight.
That's right.
Yeah.
Question, and this is totally personal. I have some of my best work from about 10 to 1, 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. And I can sort of tell at like 9:30 whether I might as well just go to bed or I should get back to the desk. And I do fairly creative work, writing and stuff. But what's going on what's going on, or am I wrong, and should I stop doing that and do that kind of stuff earlier?
The answer to your first part of the question is I don't know. Should you stop doing it? Hell no. Keep doing it. I wish I had 3 hours of good work in me any time of day. No, and I think it's actually I think it's another important point to Christian's questions about like the meme. Is the other thing is that we should do a better job of observing our own behavior. We don't do that very much. Again, it's partly this half-awake thing, and so we should. And so I think that simply making that observation about yourself is helpful, and even running even sort of small experiments on ourselves, saying, okay, what is it like if I do this stuff between 10 and 1? Do I really get more done? What is it like if I work out in the morning or in the afternoon? And just basically, widen our eyes a little bit, enhance our wakefulness a little bit, and observe our own behavior. And I think what you're doing is great. So if you have a time, a window, I don't care when it is, if you have a window where you're doing great work, don't mess with that.
This is stepping back a bit. You're now a few books in. They're all fairly research intensive. Can you talk about your process of organizing this torrent of information and deciding what to pursue, what not to pursue, and how to filter through information?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So we talk about like larks and owls, and we can also talk about like hares and tortoises, all right? And I'm a tortoise. I'm a big-time tortoise. I'm a slow. I'm a slow writer. I'm a slow reader. I'm a slow researcher, all right? And so I do it in a very slow, laborious way. So for instance, so on this one, all right? So let me give you an example of this. So when I decided to work on the book, what I do when I decide to work on a book is I'll actually write a proposal, maybe a 30-page proposal. And I write that proposal largely for myself. Basically say, here's what the book is about, here's why no one else has written it, here's why it's super interesting and cool, and here's who will buy it. And so I'll do a little bit. So for this one, when I started writing, I threw out another proposal before I wrote this one. And when I looked at some of the early research on this, and I found it really interesting. And then in terms of the research itself, what I will do is I'll just start, all right? So I'll know a little bit about the literature. So maybe I'll go to that judge study, all right, which is fairly well known. And so I'll look at that judge study, and then what I will do is I will say, that'll give me, even that one paper alone will give me a sense of what the other literature is out there. And then I'll pull some of those papers, all right? And then maybe I'm fortunate to know a decent number of academics, and I'll email them and say, hey, what should I be reading about X, Y, or Z? In this particular case, for this book, because there was so much, and it was so cross-disciplinary, I enlisted 2 research assistants. One of them, neither like full-time, one of them maybe close to full three-quarter, another one maybe a quarter. And one of them would do things like this. So a guy is a terrific fellow named Cameron French, who's a Swarthmore grad. He worked for Barry Schwartz, who wrote Paradox of Choice. He is now working in Angela Duckworth's lab at Penn. And so what I would say, I'll give you an example. I came across belonging. It's like, oh God, there's something going on with belonging. And I'll say, Cam, find like the 50 most important papers on belonging, and give me a bibliography of those, and then tell me what you think are the 5 most important papers. And give me like a 2-sentence description of those. And then so I'll get a little memo, I don't even get it, I put it in Dropbox. And then what I'll do is I'll read those 5 papers. And I'll say, oh, okay, I'm beginning to learn a little bit about this. Then I'll follow the footnotes. Hey, this is really interesting. Oh, McGillicuddy 2004 is in every one of these papers. What's going on here? Oh, I better read McGillicuddy 2004, and I'll do it that way. When I got to, and so it's basically just like, it's this sort of detective work. You just read stuff and follow up. Read stuff and follow up. And I think pretty good notes on that. I write down what my questions are. And where I really hit a slow point was in researching some of the stuff on, from the natural sciences, like in medicine and even in like biology or molecular biology, where I would go through these papers and I would read a paper And I'm not joking, I would literally like underline all the words that I didn't know the meaning of. No, I'm not joking. And then I would look up those words, and then I would read the paper again, and then I would read it again. And then a lot of this stuff, the other research assistant who I brought in, I think a lot of the super, super interesting research being done out there is on big data. I think that some of the work being done with these ginormous data sets is so interesting, and I write about a lot of these things. So some of the research on medicine came from that. There's one of my favorite studies is a study of looking at patterns of moods by analyzing 500 million tweets. And some of the math in those papers is over my head. And so there's another fellow who I brought in, he's now a PhD student at Duke, named Shreyas Raghavan, and basically my conversation with Shreyas were basically, can you explain the math to me? Okay, can you explain it again? Okay, can you explain it one more time? Is she saying, no, that's not what she's saying. And just making sure that I use Dropbox. I use a lot of like what I call big ass stickies, which are like giant Post-it notes, where I write things. I use whiteboards, and I just go back and go back and go back and go back. And when I feel like I have enough material for, say, a chapter or something like that, then I'll start writing that chapter. And then inevitably that'll lead me back to more research. But it's really, really, I mean, it's totally interesting, but it's really, really time consuming. I mean, it takes me a really, really long time to do it that way. But here's the thing, it's basically the only way I know how to do it. I wish I were. I see these other people, I mean, I'm envious. Like I see reasonably well-known writer, you know, as a column, and, you know, an 800-word column, and it'll be like due in 2 hours, and he hasn't written it yet. Oh God, I have a column due in 2 hours, I better write it. You know, or this fellow, terrific smart guy, a guy named Andrew Ross Sorkin, who is at the New York Times. He also hosts a show on CNBC. He has a New York Times weekly, at least once weekly, New York Times column. And he hosts a show first thing in the morning, and he runs a whole section of the paper. And he's like writing his column on his phone during the commercial breaks. Or do you know Siddharth Mukherjee?
No.
Siddharth, okay, this is another person I hate. Siddharth Mukherjee, all right? Siddharth Mukherjee, he's a physician. He has a lab at Columbia, and he's written 2 books. Both of them have been ginormous sellers. One of them is called The Emperor of All Maladies, which was made into an award-winning PBS special, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, all right? So between us, we have an average of 1/2 Pulitzer Prizes.
Actually, a third.
Oh, but for all 3 of us, yeah, we each have an average of a third. And he wrote another book called The Cell, which is The Gene. Sorry, The Gene. Wrote another book called The Gene. And Mukherjee will like, oh, you know, I'm taking a little break from doing some surgery. Let me go write a few paragraphs. You know, and I'm like the guy reading the paper 3 times because I don't understand it. So I don't necessarily advise my method. I advise being a lot smarter. In doing that, but anyway, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's very, 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 very laborious, and I use a lot of paper. I don't have digitized. I mentioned this to somebody, they didn't even know what the heck it was. Anybody know what a red weld is? Yeah, of course. Okay, so I use, you know what a red weld is? It's like a giant accordion file, paper accordion file.
Oh, that's what they're, okay.
Yeah. I have like basically cornered the market on red welds. Like I'm worried they're never going to make them anymore with these giant accordion files. So I have massive paper files, and that's how I do it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for such a long-winded, discursive answer. Is there anything particular that you wanted to know? Now that you know too much about. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Hi there. Was there anything that showed up in the research that was related to the spiritual nature of time? I remember reading at one point kairos and chronos, and that originally there were 2 words for time, and nature's time, divine timing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. No, I'm totally with you. I don't mean to be dismissive of that. I actually avoided trying to write about time per se because some of it made my head hurt. But there's some really, really interesting stuff out there, and there's some really, really good books on that particular topic. I think there's some interesting research in anthropology and even in social psychology about different cultural conceptions of time. So some people believe in basically, I mean, there's clock time and event time. So if you have people from my kids in Washington, I live in Washington D.C. My kids go to an international school, and it's a bilingual school, so in Spanish, and so there are a lot of their friends are from Latin America, or their families are originally from Latin America, and so you know you have a birthday party for a 6-year-old, and they're just mystified. I mean, they understand, but they're sort of like, whoa, these Americans are kind of weird here. They're like, oh, we're having a birthday party for Billy, and it goes from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And they're like, well, how do you know when the party's going to end? The party ends when it ends. Like, there's no, you cut it off at, what? That's weird, all right? And so different notions of that. But let me give you some good books on that. I think one of the very, very best books about sort of getting it's hard to get your mind around time. One of the very, very best books is a book called Einstein's Dreams. If you read that by Alan Lightman at MIT. There's another good contemporary book by a fellow named Alan Burdick called Why Time Flies that is really good at those kinds of issues. I sort of I kind of skated, or I sort of like made a detour around that neighborhood.
The answer to why time flies is so that you can see how fast the flies are going.
Yes, exactly. Well, right. It's true.
You mentioned that.
Yeah, right. There's a whole thing. Actually, it's interesting.
It's a wonderfully scholarly.
It's an interesting puzzle, actually, about how you unpack the phrase. There's a famous. It's not true, but there's a famous Groucho Marx line. He never said it, but it's attributed to him. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana. And it turns out that ends up being this interesting puzzle that has been used in AI and machine learning and cognitive science about how do you get systems to understand that.
And our final question for the evening?
Mine is more regarding productivity and throughout the day. Also a Dan here, so that would be 3 Dans.
Great.
So during the lull, is there anything you can do like exercise, or have you noticed like through your own time, is it always subjective to who you are? Or is there a way to be productive in the lull time?
Yeah, I think what you have to do is, I think you have to take more breaks and intentional breaks. And so, and there are different kinds of breaks that you can take. You can take these kind of restorative breaks that I was talking about before, but depending on what you're doing, you want to take something more akin to a vigilance break, which is what happens in surgery. So I write a little bit about going to the University of Michigan Medical Center and standing in on a surgery and having these surgeons, literally take a step back, not surgeons and other medical professionals, literally taking a step back from the table to go over a checklist or things like that. So you can use things like checklists, depending on the urgency of what you're doing. You can take more, intentional breaks. I mean, again, we don't have, we can't just kick off for the entire afternoon, even though if we'd like to. So what we should do is we should move certain kinds of work there and then use other kinds of mechanisms, breaks, and depending on the urgency of what you're doing, checklists and things like that to get better. On the question of exercise, there's some good evidence on like time of day to exercise. Morning exercise is good for some things. Afternoon exercise is good for other things. Morning exercise is good if you want to lose weight. It seems to be better for habit formation, and it gives you an enduring mood boost. So physical exercise, aerobic exercise gives us a mood boost. If you exercise late in the day, you sleep away some of that mood boost. So that's morning exercise. Afternoon exercise is better for avoiding injury because you're literally more warmed up, your body temperature is higher. People report finding it less effortful, so they enjoy it more, and it seems to be better for performance. Your lung function is higher, hand-eye coordination is higher, and things like that. But what I would advise you, other Dan, is pay attention, like figure out what works for you. Try something, and then observe your own behavior and figure out whether that works for you. So, does taking a 10-minute walk break do anything for you? It probably will, but it might not. Is having a checklist of some kind helpful to you? is simply going to work, if you have the means to do that, like going to do your work in a different physical setting. Does that work for you? Just be observant about your own behavior. And again, I just sort of going back to the William James thing, which is truly has haunted me for 20 years. It's like be more than half awake, even during the trough.
Well,
all right.
Thanks, Dan.